Okay, welcome to the University of Texas Energy Symposium, special edition here as part of UT Energy Week 2024. I'm Kerry King, Assistant Director at the Energy Institute and a research scientist here at the University of Texas at Austin. So for today's talk, it is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Nemerson. Matthew is Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Budderfly. This is an energy efficiency company. For 5 years, he's been part of the team creating energy efficiency for commercial buildings and outsourcing via the company Budderfly. And they handle ideas from strategy to marketing and client selection and sales for targeting of energy efficiency in buildings. It's grown to an over $120 million company with 275 employees and was on the top 10 list in the 2021 INC 5000 list. He's a graduate of Yale and Columbia. We won't hold that against him here. But the abstract of his talk today, in the scope, there are about 6 million commercial buildings in the United States, and some experts believe that about 30% of these buildings could save $150 billion in energy spending every year. And many energy service companies, or ESCOs, have tried to introduce business models to take advantage of this and reduce these energy costs, but it has not gone as far as many think. So today, our speaker, Matthew Nemerson, is going to give us a question, or he's going to tell us about how Budderfly has solved this, created new business models to tackle this energy savings and cost savings opportunity in commercial buildings. So with that said, without further ado, so this is, please have your questions ready. For the end of the talk, we'll go for 40 minutes or so, and then you can have questions and answers at the end. And for those of you streaming online, submit your questions via Zoom and Q&A, and we can try to ask those as well. So with that said, let's welcome Matthew Nemerson.
Thank you. You're going to switch to? Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I know we're competing with lunch, and I guess people will be coming in. I have to say that I met Kerry on a trip where I was a +1 with my wife for energy transitions in Denmark. We hit it off, and he invited me. And, you know, I thought I was going to be speaking to his class, and so obviously I'm delighted to be part of this much larger operation. And so sort of like signing up for open mic and finding you're the leadoff act at South by Southwest. But whatever, I'm here to have a good time and to talk to you about energy efficiency, which is perhaps the least respected part of the energy transition. But many people, obviously we at our company, believe it's perhaps the most important because it's the thing that we can do quickest as a global community, and it's the thing that maybe can get us the quickest to net zero by 2050. Are we good? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so energy efficiency, just to start off very quickly, makes a lot of sense. And you know, all of the experts out there say we're talking about literally trillions of dollars of savings, getting it to market much quicker than with other things that are obviously a lot sexier, like green hydrogen and financing sort of utility scale solar. But the point is, if we really want to do things quickly, we have to deal with the fact that the installed building base of millions and millions of buildings, 6 million, as Kerry mentioned, in the United States, are just wasting a tremendous amount of energy. And as we'll talk about later, you know, depending upon where that energy is coming from, if we really want to start saving and decarbonizing, the thing is for them simply to use less energy and to do it quickly. Are we okay here? Yeah. Okay, so again, we can save probably around 30%. Some buildings 50%, some buildings maybe only 10, but on average we think we can save about 30% of the energy that's being used. And in the United States, not 2 trillion or 3 trillion, but McKinsey says 1 trillion. That's still a lot of money. Now that's across all of the different energy sectors. We're only dealing with commercial, as we'll talk about later. We've got residential, obviously, industrial and transportation, and we're all looking at different things there, and that's where a lot of the big debates are going on, whether it's for electrification of cars, trying to sort of deal with electrification of industrial things. We believe that commercial buildings are the easiest, lowest hanging fruit. And so the number that we're focusing on, if we were to really focus on commercial buildings and dealing with energy efficiency, 45 billion. Let me just ask a quick question here, if I'm allowed to do that. What buildings use the most energy per square foot? Any guesses? If you were to sort of pick the lowest hanging fruit, the building type in the United States, Western democracies that use the most energy, what would it be? What's that? Data centers. That's what probably most people would say. Anybody else? What? Grocery stores. Okay, good. Somebody else? Residential houses use the most per square foot? Okay, maybe, maybe not. So let's hold those. We'll get the answer at the end, so that'll keep you here from going out to get dessert. Anyway, so here's the challenge. Here's the overall energy intensity that we've seen as a country for this last 100 years. As you can see, it's gone up, it's gone down, but basically we haven't really changed very much in 100 years. And so that's kind of sort of interesting when we think about all the different technologies, all the different sources of energy and whatever. Just in terms of good old BTUs per square foot has not changed very much since the dawn of the major industrial era. We've seen different times where it sort of went down when there were big energy spikes and people started using less. Maybe that was more conservation. And clearly we've gone up. And somehow we've absorbed things like air conditioning and other kinds of things without having big changes. So we can see sort of what the toleration is in terms of the cost, because this all ends up being a cost per square foot. Although clearly starting in the early 70s, as many of us who are older remember, the energy sort of cost of everything changed dramatically, and there have been sort of policy changes since then. But so here's the fundamental argument. The argument is that energy efficiency, as you can see to the left, sort of far and away the cheapest way to sort of produce energy. Now, obviously, you're producing a negawatt, a negative watt of energy, but as you can see, with all of these fun things that we're all sort of here at the conference today and next and this week talking about, it's still far and away the cheapest. There'll probably be very few talks about it. This may be the only talk about energy efficiency this week, but the point is, it's still what we might want to focus on in terms of policy, in terms of incentives, in terms of even technology, in terms of how do we retrofit, in terms of energy efficiency. And then if we want to sort of look at, a broader range of different things in terms of where do we actually just save carbon, if we want to sort of now begin to sort of introduce the actual where the energy comes from, what you'll see is that things that are related to energy efficiency in terms of building insulation and new lighting systems and fuel efficiency and other things like that are actually saving us money. Everything else, at some point cost us some money, still good for society, still good for humanity, but it's the things to the left that we really want to focus on, and those are mostly dealing with energy efficiency or figuring out how to just use less energy in the built environment one way or another. And if we just look at it as a business, and many of you are students and are thinking about where do I really want to go into, what you can see is that energy efficiency is actually a comparable business in terms of the money that's available and the revenues to things like utility scale solar, wind, big thing on the East Coast certainly, and the actual energy value is sort of huge if we were to really focus on it as an industry and not just sort of a byproduct of either new construction or just sort of accidental things that happen when an old system fails. Okay, so now the question is, why isn't there more of it? And so from a public policy standpoint, this is the sort of interesting question. Recently, just a few weeks ago, in California, they came out and said, what we really should do is put heat pumps into every small commercial building or home. So going to the issue of where does energy used? But you can see that the cost there was, well, somebody should just come up with $750 million and we'll just put these in and then we'll figure out how to get that money back. But wouldn't it be great if we just spent the money? And so, our proposition as a company is, we can do that. In the private sector, we believe, through business models, as we'll see later, can actually do this through private capital. But right now, maybe not Texas, but other states are sort of saying, how much should we invest to sort of jumpstart our energy transition even more in our own states? And this was just something that came up and was talked about. As you know, California created huge feed-in tariffs for solar, as many places did, and now it's backed away from them saying, oops, that didn't really work because now we have actually no need for energy in the middle of the day, much too much solar, but we're still using a lot of energy at 7 p.m. How do we attract and how do we attack that? And so this is their sort of beginning to deal with that. Again, $1 billion or more, and we're saying maybe there are other ways to do it. With energy efficiency, I won't go into all of this, but there's a whole range of things that you can do, from just changing light bulbs to changing out whole systems. We as a company are looking at this whole range. But again, these are just for small businesses. The prices down there don't really sort of relate to all buildings. But clearly, there's a whole scope of things that have to be done from a public policy standpoint. And I want you to think about all of this list, because this is going to get to one of the next reasons that energy efficiency isn't done. It's just too complicated. It's one thing to hook up solar panels on your roof. I kind of get that if I want to decarbonize my energy use. It's very difficult to sort of deal with the fact that many of these are going to have their own installation techniques, they're going to have their own installers, their own vendors. There'll be 10 or 12 brands for each of them. How do I deal with hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of different choices on what to do if somebody says, use less energy? And so this gets to the whole idea of market failures and what isn't happening. And so we can go through all of this in a lot of detail, but very simply, the first thing, of course, for everything, every conversation here says there's no carbon tax. I realize that that's probably against the law to say that in Texas. But the truth is, if you don't charge properly for carbon, everything else becomes a strange sort of non-business related decision because we haven't priced in all the externalities. And so that's number one for everything. Some energy is just so cheap that people say, I don't care if I use too much. It's better for me to spend less money to not save it than it is to try to save it. And that's going to be a problem that's going to follow us through all the way. But still, there's this other fundamental issue with buildings, not for the University of Texas, but for most of the buildings in town. One person owns the building, somebody else pays the meter charges. And so why should I spend money up front if all I'm doing is transferring a sort of vague benefit to my tenant or to the person who's going to buy the co-op or whatever later, and they'll use less energy. So this whole split incentive is a huge issue for energy efficiency. Then the other thing is a lot of people just over-promise. You know, Tesla, I know another Texas company, is going to go 350 miles. It really only goes 250 miles, and now I'm really upset. And that's true for heat pumps. That's true for insulation. Everybody says it's going to be great. Oftentimes it's not. People get very sort of suspicious of the whole idea of what's really going on there. And then people assume they confuse energy efficiency with energy conservation, and I don't really want to be hot in the summer, cold in the winter, so maybe I'm not really so much into this. And you can see that politically in arguments about, do I want to get rid of my gas stove? Do I like, induction cooking? Won't that screw up my entire life? And so there's a lot of sort of errors in people's presumptions about what's going to happen. So again, what happens? Manufacturers overprice efficiency because they say if you want it, it's a luxury good. You're going to be sort of a very rarefied part of the audience. They underprice inefficiency because that's what the common product is. So if you look at the actual energy standards, even Energy Star, they're actually pretty minimal, and they really don't move the needle tremendously, either at commercial or residential levels. And then we have all sorts of errors in terms of how do we actually create a business model where somebody's incentivized to create a very, very efficient building, and who's going to pay for that downstream. And so those are the kinds of issues that we were thinking about as we were creating Budderfly, as you'll see in a little bit. And then finally, how do you actually measure all these things? As many of you may know, in most business conversations, there's something called measurement and verification, and that is something which is often ends up in lawsuits. Did you really save me something? What really happened? What is the weather's impact? What is my utility, my actual use of the building's impact? So it's very hard downstream to figure out what happened to energy efficiency, given the fact that the future is unknowable, and how I use a building and what's going to happen in terms of temperatures and whatever keeps changing. So lots of skepticism in the whole idea of how do we create these. Now, a lot of the energy and efficiency NGOs have looked at this, and so the NRDC has a whole sort of list, which I have here in this very interesting chart, because what you'll see if you look at the right-hand side is at the end of the day, every solution is always either more money or more education or new standards, all of the things that have been politicized in this country over the last 10 or 15 years. And so, yes, the split incentives, lack of sort of understanding of savings, too much discussion. The one I like the best is the bounded rationality, which is the whole idea, is if I give you two choices, A or B, maybe C, you can make the choice. If I give you 15 choices, you almost always say, come back to me in a year. Let's just wait. I'm really not ready for this. And so that's what a lot of these issues come down to. And then there's even more, which is, for whatever reason, psychologically, when people start talking, when they're building a building or they're making an investment in a new boiler or some insulation or whatever, they always want a payback for some reason in 1 year or 2 years. Somehow we've discounted the whole idea of energy savings to have such a large discount rate that we basically say, if I can't get it back in 2 years or 3 years, I'm not interested. Obviously, when you put in a new roof, you're sort of willing to spend for 20 years. When you buy a car, maybe 7 years. And so there are sort of different internal discount rates that we all carry with us. And for whatever reason, we didn't invent the world. We're just living in it. Energy efficiency has a very, very high future discount rate. And so, and with many people, with many businesses, energy might be 3%, 4%, 5%, maybe even 10% of their total costs. So the idea is, I can save you 5%, or I can save you 10% or 15%. They go, well, 10% of 5%, not interested. And so when you look at it collectively as a society, obviously makes a huge impact. That's what we're trying to deal with, climate change. But when you look at it for individual decision makers, it's a meh kind of thing. I'll get to it when I get to it. I really would rather spend my money on something else. And especially when you look at things that are very hard to quantify, like a new window or attic insulation or things like that, if we're talking about residential. These are things that, unless you're sort of giving it away, it's very hard for people to make that decision, especially if their current equipment isn't at the end of its useful life. And we have another phenomena, which is when things do break, they often break just because of the nature of energy. An air conditioner will almost always break, as we say, on July 4th, and a heating system will almost always break on Christmas Eve. I'm sure you've all had that experience, which means that when you're trying to replace it, you're going to take whatever your local guy or gal has in the warehouse and can get it in 2 days. That's not a way that you plan for system renewal and system upgrades. And so getting advances on this is very, very important. So, trying to be a little academic here, there have been many, many studies of this. This is from a Harvard and Duke joint study. I've added the green. But there are different ways that we can, as a society, look at this, where we can trade off units of energy efficiency versus the cost of those units. And so somewhere between sort of the social optimum, where we'll actually all accept it, and the technology optimum, as you can see on this at opposite ends of the chart, we think in the middle there is going to be a capital market optimum, and that's what we're trying to achieve with venture capital and private equity, and looking at this as a system where somebody else can make the decisions for all of these irrational, as you've seen, kinds of inputs that go into energy efficiency. Okay, so what do models look like? And again, some of you may be very familiar with these. Others, this may be, I didn't know there were models for energy efficiency. So the first thing is, what do buyers look for? And clearly, in order to get people out of the idea of not doing anything, we need to sort of figure out what's actually going to work, where the ROIs are going to make sense to them somehow, whatever model they actually use. Solutions probably can't cost a lot, or if it costs somebody a lot, it's probably not the person making the decision, which makes it difficult. And then vendors have to have some track record. They don't want sort of a fly-by-night person coming in promising that may or may not work. So there is sort of a bounded area in which any company or any offering has to work. And performance risk is clearly an issue, because no one wants their building to be too cold or too hot at the wrong time of the year, or simply not work. And so sticking with what you've got, even if it's inefficient and it's kind of old and it might break next year, is often what a lot of people, even smart businesses, end up with. So if we sort of look at this in terms of, well, what are my choices? Clearly, everybody has the choice to do nothing, and that's often what's done. That's usually what's done. And as you can see, probably not a great idea, because you probably will have your system break one Christmas Eve or one 4th of July. Savings, obviously there are no savings, and but your capital costs are low, and that's great. Didn't cost me anything, so that's pretty good. And then my time commitment in dealing with this intellectually, mentally, not there. And as we move across, you can see what the traditional thing is to do is to hire people in and to try to figure out how to do it. These have lots of costs. They sometimes work. Sometimes the vendors don't work together. You can move on and bring an expert in who will charge you a lot. Expertise usually does cost a lot, but as you can see, you probably have the highest savings, but also the highest costs and the highest sort of investment, because now you've got to manage all of this. And then what we're talking about here in terms of the sort of paradigm shift is outsource everything. And in this case, it's going to work, because in our case, or in anybody's case in our shoes, the outsourcer has the risk. You're not going to save quite as much, because we're going to take some of the little extra vig to sort of save some of that energy, but costs are low and the time commitment is low. So this is sort of the paradigm that people are sort of faced with, at least we believe, in this model. And as you can see, if you fully cost out all of the things that go into not doing something or doing it yourself, you can see there's a lot of sort of extra costs that people usually don't talk about, which is the reason they don't do anything, which is why the do nothing often comes in, because when they look at do it yourself, they realize that's a big pain in the neck. And then the contract out or outsourcing is a question mark. Do I trust these people? Don't I trust them? And that's when you get into those questions about reliability and all the questions we talked about before. Okay, so here's the fundamental model of any energy efficiency system. You pay for new equipment. Somebody pays for new equipment. You save some of that energy, which is the savings used, and then somebody actually doesn't get those savings for a while because they go to pay off the equipment. And so as we'll see, the business models get into how does that darker box in the middle get handled? Who's paying for it? Who's taking the risk for it? Who's actually being responsible for that? But the fundamental idea is, to the left, I'm using amount of energy. To the right, there's a big savings there, and somehow I've got to get from the left to the right and figure out how to pay for this equipment, decide what to put in that big box that we saw with many, many different options. And so there's a program, and somebody's promising you something, and it's very much what we've seen now with anybody who's purchased solar. They come in, they tell you this is going to be amazing, your electric bill will be zero, it's not zero, your savings will be infinite, it's not infinite, you're probably paying in many cases more than you paid for the electricity before, but you feel great about it, you have solar panels on the roof, and if the electric bills keep going up, someday 8 years down the road, you go, this is amazing, I'm saving money. I love solar, I have solar on my houses, but what I'm saying is there's lots of questions out there, and it's never as simple as the people selling it, and the same is true for energy efficiency. So here's the sort of fundamental model that people sort of invented to sort of get big companies, big universities. I'm not sure about University of Texas, but famously Ohio State signed a $50 billion model to sort of make their campus energy efficient. They did it with a French company that came in, financed billions and billions of dollars, actually handed them a $2 billion check just to sort of thank them for giving them the contract. And now somebody else manages all the systems at Ohio State, and I'm sure that there's probably a similar thing going on here at UT. So the idea is you have what we call an ESCO, an energy service company. They're dealing with the utilities. They somehow finance all of the equipment. The financer is looking at the creditworthiness of the end user one way or another. So they're adding on costs, their interest costs and whatever. And so you have this fundamental model where you've got one team on the right that's sort of looking at what's happening, and a team on the left that's actually paying everything and financing everything. There's a lot of leakage in the system, as we saw. The costs are pretty high. But this is sort of the model that we're all using. And a lot of people are sort of not interested in leveraging their campus, their buildings, whatever, to this financing party, even if it's going to be working, because again, their discount rate is too high and their desire to have an ROI is too great. So this sort of evolved a little bit. So then the ESCO said, okay, we'll take on the financing and we'll make sure that this all works. We'll charge more. We'll try to figure out how much we can charge. We'll now take on some of that credit risk for the end user. We'll also sort of guarantee to everybody that this is going to work. So we enter in some insurance companies. We enter in very complicated contracts that sort of make sure that the ESCO is putting in things that can save money, that they can afford to pay back the financing, and user continues to pay the bills. But mixed into all of this are extra costs. And so what we found is it's great for large institutions. It's sort of good occasionally for government. But for most businesses, and certainly for most smaller businesses, they're just not creditworthy enough. No ESCOs have been willing to get into this market. So when you look at buildings in America, which we're going to do in a little bit, what you realize is there's this range of very large buildings, but the majority of buildings in America are less than 10,000 square feet. 50% of all commercial buildings, there's 6 million buildings, 3 million of them are smaller than 10,000 square feet, which means they're used by people who probably don't have the creditworthiness of an Ohio State or a city of Austin. And so it's hard for them to do this because there are very few energy companies that are willing to take on that risk of capital. So what Budderfly did was sort of look at this market and realize that there actually wasn't that much risk in working with small users because each of their electric bills were small enough that if you happened to make a mistake, you could probably make it up on the next company. And so by creating a portfolio of risk, as most financial institutions do when they're looking at mortgages or other kinds of car loans or whatever it is, which was, we know, usually work out. They don't always work out, but they often do, that you can come up with a model here, which is what we're calling right now the Budderfly sort of model, where we take on all of the risk. We finance ourselves as a technology company would with venture capital, now with private equity. So they're betting on us to sort of figure out all these technology issues. They're not betting necessarily on our clients to figure out how to make the right decision once we sign a contract. But here's how the contract works. We go to our clients and we basically say, you will now have a fixed amount of energy use for the next 10 years. We will charge you based on a kilowatt hour, which is 95% or 96 or 94, depending upon what we're doing, of the number of kilowatt hours that you've used in the past. We will charge you mark to market every month based on software that we have, which knows the tariff in every utility in the country. So that's sort of a barrier to entry that we've created, so we can recreate that relationship between a client and the utility in every location. What we then do is we pay the utility bill. We become the actual owner of that meter. And so the energy equipment investment that we make is to reduce that energy use to a point where we can make money without charging our client based on the reduction in kilowatt hours as a ratio of the savings that we're getting from that new equipment that's put in. So we're basically taking all of the promises that everyone has ever made in this industry, nothing new there, and instead of saying it's magic, trust me, in the next 7 years, next 10 years, you're going to be so happy, we're now betting on ourselves that we can do this. We look at this literally every day for every one of our clients. So when something isn't working, we can zoom in on that building and we can sort of figure out what isn't happening. We can make adjustments, we can add equipment, we can change the equipment. So now you actually have an active participant, pretty much for the first time ever. Utilities just aren't in a position to sort of scrutinize all of their clients, and somebody who puts in new attic insulation, or puts in a new window, or puts in a new air conditioner or heating system, they're not coming back. They may want your maintenance contract, but they're not looking at your building every single day to say how you're doing, did you save money. Every once in a while, we've had Nest thermostats and Ecobee and others who have said, we're going to give you this capability, but only companies really in our position who are studying every single client, every piece of equipment, and every utility sort of impact every single day are in a position to actually understand the relationship between equipment and savings. So it's a bit of a different model. Again, it's a version of these other models, but we think it's scalable, and we think it's something that needs to have more attention in things like the IRA and in Rewire America, folks who are sort of looking at both decarbonization and trying to get the whole society closer to net zero. We think this is a good model. So, again, just more details about us. We have, again, we take care of the equipment. We sign these contracts, so people are bound to us, but there's always a way out, because one of the things people hate in energy contracts is to not have that flexibility. Their antenna go up that something doesn't smell right, it might be a scam. So we make sure they can always buy themselves out, and then they make payments to us, and that in essence becomes the off-taker. We are sort of managing all of that. One of the big things is that versus the other models that we have, which tend to be hundreds and hundreds of pages of contracts because of the complexity of measurement and verification and any changes, because in most cases, those financing groups that are financing the projects directly, they want this to be like a bond. They want this to be like a solar project. They want to sort of study every outcome that could possibly happen over the next 10, 20 years. Because we're taking on all of the financial risk, we're able to have much simpler contracts. We're able to use whatever equipment we want. We've been able, because we're now buying and making the decisions for literally thousands and thousands and thousands of businesses, we can go and sit down with the major equipment manufacturers, and we can say, you're not just selling to a distributor who's selling in Greater Austin, or you're not just selling even to a Home Depot. You're now selling to somebody who's representing tens of thousands eventually of buildings across America, and we make the decisions. So we're able to get very, very good deals. We have the lowest cost for top-of-the-line carrier equipment and Fujitsu, which is two of our big partners. And what we're also able to do is uniquely buy from them their most efficient models. Now remember, I said at the very beginning that the pricing of these products is a little bit out of whack. Efficiency is seen as a premium product, and they overcharge for it. And so we're able to go in and actually say, look, we're going to be buying a lot of these. We do want the best model, but tell us, how much does that really cost more than the standard models that you're buying? In this business, there's a measurement called SEER, which is sort of the energy efficiency sort of rating for air conditioning and certain types of heating systems. Government says you have to have a 15. We tend to buy 23, 24, which is almost 50% more efficient. And while the cost of that might be double if you went into a showroom to buy it, the actual manufacturing cost might only be 10 or 20% more. And so we're able to sort of take those externalities and then bring them in and reduce the costs of efficiency. Okay, so let's go back to our first question. If you had to pick as a public policy issue the most important or easiest to save kilowatt hours, where would you go? And I think we had data centers, we had grocery stores, and we had residential. So, let's start out with this chart, which I assume as energy people, you all go to bed and look at this every night, or you have it on your bathroom wall. This is the entire energy system in America. I love Sankey diagrams. And so, fortunately, this year, the amount of energy used hit 100 quads, which means that all of the numbers here are both energy use for the country, and they're also percentages, which just makes life a lot easier, so you don't have to do any sort of complex arithmetic in your brain. And what you can see is one thing about energy, which is the fundamental problem with the human condition, which the vast majority of energy is rejected energy, right? So the vast majority of energy is the energy that goes to produce energy, that produce motion, that produces electricity. It never hits our homes, it never uses our cars. It's just basically heat and a little bit of stuff that's coming out of smokestacks and things. So a lot of wasted energy here. So which goes to the whole issue of why there's such a dynamic of saving efficiency, because energy is itself just very inefficient. Now, what I've superimposed electrical spend over these different areas. So we're going to take out transportation for a second. Now, you got residential, commercial, and industrial. And so we as a company are focusing on commercial, which most of the ESCOs do. Young man mentioned residential. Now, residential does use the most electricity as a group. The problem is that people are irrational, and getting someone to control their temperature at the same temperature every day or at night or whatever. As we know, Nest has tried this. Everybody's talked about it. Very hard to do. Industrial energy uses are problematic because they actually make things, and they actually convert energy into actual things, and there are all sorts of machines and other things there. So it's very hard to sort of save energy when you're making aluminum. Believe me, the Gateses and other people in the world, all of their experimental energy, and probably a lot of your students here, many of you, are trying to figure out how to come up with more efficient uses for industrial processes, but hard to do. So commercial buildings just tend to be simpler. They tend to have the same routines every day. You tend to be able to have a little bit of an autocracy there. If you set the temperature, people can't complain that much. It's not like your kids want it to be hotter or cooler in the home, so you keep changing your thermostat. So we think that $150 billion is the place to go. Now, the sad thing here is, while solar is expanding, as we know, geometrically every year, as you can see, it's still a very, very small player here, as is geothermal. Wind is sort of getting up there, but as you can see, the world is still mostly about natural gas, petroleum, and amazingly still coal. And so all of those things sort of come into sort of effect when you look at things. So here's the answer to the question, which is, where is energy used? And so grocery stores was actually pretty much the closest right answer here. Just a lot of refrigeration. But if you kick it up one scale, it's actually food service, because food service not only keeps things cold, but it keeps things hot, does things very quickly. It has people at one end, it has products, it's a factory that's turning a frozen puck of meat into something warm and delicious at the other end. So what does that mean? Who is the biggest user as an institution per square foot as a system? It's McDonald's. And, I think most of us, probably that doesn't, I can tell you, I've done this speech many times, it doesn't come top of mind. People don't think of McDonald's as the largest energy user. And that could be Wendy's, it could be Popeyes, it could be whatever, In-N-Out Burger. The point is, it probably could be a taco shop, which I've had 6 tacos in the last 12 hours, so the fact that I'm still standing is also amazing. So food service. Now, if we want to drill down a little bit more, we can see that it is actually fast food, and it is sort of amazing to me, because you can see grocery stores, which is a good answer, but grocery stores use half the energy of a McDonald's, which to me is all, and so still sort of somewhat amazing. Hospitals are up there, and you can also see, just as a human, you can see the difference between the total energy intensity, which includes all that wasted energy. So that'll differ a little bit if you have propane, or you have petroleum, or you're just pure electricity for where your energy is coming from. But you can see that the building is what we talk about and what you would be judged on if you were part of Local Law 97, which is now penalizing buildings that use too much energy. So all of these will become legal scales that people have to live within in the future. But you can see that the total energy, which we don't talk about as a society, to actually produce that energy and to produce that ability to heat or cool or refrigerate your building, isn't even in the calculation. But our you and our grandchildren, my grandchildren, will all be sort of dealing with those. So now we drill down into that food service, and so what you can see is it just costs a lot to cook things, refrigeration, space heating. So we as a company decided that if we're going to pick one industry to work on, we're going to pick on fast food, because we wanted to sort of hit the ground running. We wanted to be able to sort of save a lot of energy in small units and test out our new model. And so interestingly, when you look at where most energy companies go, they go to office buildings or universities or big, easy to sort of find players that are using millions of dollars of energy. We went to these folks where the average McDonald's is only using $45,000 a year of energy. And so if we can save 20 or 30%, if we make a mistake, we're talking 1,000 here, 1,000 there, we'll make it up on the next one. But you can see, and these numbers are a little bit old, McDonald's uses $1 billion a year of energy, so you can make a business around $1 billion if you can save 30% of it. And so that's where we are as a company, and these are all sort of names that you all know and love, and you can sort of get a sense of what it actually costs society in energy when you get that Big Mac. And so I'll just wrap up and say, we've been in business for 5 years. This model was very controversial because people think that restaurants go out of business every year, or one out of, most restaurants don't last 5 years. That may have been true a generation ago, but franchises aren't going anywhere. These are big corporations. These are traded as very almost like bonds. We're doing fine. We're over $100 million in energy management now. And we've raised over $500 million of private equity and a couple $100 million more of debt to sort of go with that. And as Carrie said, we were the number 10 company on the Inc. 5000. So whatever we're doing, it works. But the reason I'm here is not to sort of pitch Budderfly, but just to say that there are different ways to think about the energy transition as a society. And we don't always have to rely on government programs or prescription models that tell us, what to do or how to save. That the private sector, if it's sort of given the right to have dominion over a building type, because we can aggregate it and we can bring the power of the private markets, capital markets to bear, can make a lot of smart decisions. We're saving as a portfolio probably over 20% now. We're adding in new technologies, heat pumps and other things. Once we get to 24%, 2-4% more as a portfolio of these 6,000 sites, we'll be making a lot of money, and we'll be able to sort of double and triple and quadruple the size of our company. And so, what's fascinating, and this is sort of the miracle of the private sector, is we're pretty much the only ones in North America that are doing this. There may be tiny little companies that are doing it, but most other people either want to have a guarantee in terms of the off-taker, or want to deal with big buildings, or just don't want to have that responsibility to sort of say, I bet that I can save you energy and I can make it work. So instead, they're just not adopting our model. So for us, we're very happy. We have the marketplace to ourselves. And for society, we're going to be down in Washington. We're going to be sort of talking about this to see what kind of models we can build on this to get more of the energy efficiency transition in place. So that's my talk, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Matt. Let me try the other microphone, maybe.
Yeah. So happy to answer any questions.
Do have time for a few questions. I think the takeaway, I like to think of myself as a relatively smart guy here at an academic university. I think the takeaway was, if we want to save energy, stop eating fast food. I think, is that what you said? Okay. Maybe not. Maybe that's not what you said.
Well, no, because as somebody else said, grocery stores use a lot of energy. So the idea is stop eating. Now, I think there are people in the environmental movement
I agree.
who sort of agree
effective
with that and would say, we're the problem, and if we weren't here. So yes, I think it's mostly humans. I think it's human existence that we have to sort of deal with.
Good.
But that's not a popular thing to say.
All right, so we have a couple of questions
That's better in
online, and some
Connecticut.
of you are diligently using the Slido app, which I am looking at. I see a couple hands here, so I'll try to come to you. I'm going to ask this question from online, which is related to something I was thinking. It says your business model savings of 10 to 20%. I think maybe you put 20 to 30%.
Yeah.
This question is sort of what changes would be needed to achieve something larger? And my question is, you're charging your clients 95% of their previous bill. Why not 90% or 85%?
Yeah. So those, of course, are the business model and marketing questions. If we look at sort of the range of savings, what is problematic with buildings is that unless you're in sort of Norway or Denmark or whatever, in North America, most buildings have been built to be pretty inefficient because it's cheaper. So if you really wanted to sort of save a lot more energy, you would deal with Northern European style windows and doors, roof systems. The whole idea of heat pumps and energy recapture and recovery ventilation, which is something used very rarely in North America, used more now in Asia just because of the advent of heat pumps. So the whole way we heat and cool, here in this room, we're probably exhausting the air and then bringing in new air from outside that we've cooled or in the wintertime heated. These are inefficient things. So changing the systems, putting in better windows, putting in better roofs, is the way to go. We mostly deal with systems. The miracle of LED lights made this industry sort of back on people's consciousness because lights use between 15 to 30% of a building's energy. The fact that you could save 60% on that transition from compact fluorescents to LEDs suddenly meant that every facilities manager in the country, starting 8-10 years ago, was able to be an energy efficiency guru because they could say, I can pay this back in 2 years or 3 years. And so what's fascinating is that hasn't moved into other things as well. Windows probably take 20 years to pay back. Insulation might take 15 years. We believe most of the things that we're doing we can do in 6.5 years. So the answer is, if you really want to save 50% of your energy, change your building codes. Try that in Texas, right? I mean, it's about government telling people what to do, not so popular.
Yeah, I have tried that, not too successfully. I'm going to ask one online here and then go to the room. How many years of energy consumption data do you think you need in a particular building or project to have confidence in going forward, or does that not matter for your portfolio?
No, it definitely matters, and that's the great thing about doing fast food restaurants, because they don't change that much. I mean, unless they suddenly go to 24 hours. We can use 1 year, 2 years, and that pretty much is it. We clearly had a COVID effect when building use during the 18 months of COVID, which is different than they had ever been before. So we had to extrapolate a lot there and sort of try to go back a couple years. But basically 2 years ought to be enough in any commercial building. Life doesn't change that much. We're pretty much creatures of habit. We can make it work for 2 years.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Very nice presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could please put it in context for me. For 20 to 30% cost savings for McDonald's, for example, how much carbon footprint are we saving in that $1 billion spend that McDonald's does if you do 20 to 30% cost savings?
Really good question. I don't have it in sort of tons of CO2. I probably should. I'll get that for you. As you saw, because commercial buildings are very electric intensive, and because the average sort of wasted energy on electricity in America is pretty much 2 to 1, so whatever that equivalency is in kilowatt hours would be basically double in terms of the actual carbon footprint. We were big fans of Scope 3 being sort of a requirement for corporations. I think it will eventually be there. which means that we can offer to McDonald's corporate, even though they don't own the actual franchises, we can offer them the sort of ability to take credit for their franchisees, which does come under Scope 3, as a carbon offset. And we can certainly in certain states get any of the credits for that. But I will look up exactly what the CO2 tonnage is. But it's basically as with any kilowatt hour would be. It's 30% of their carbon footprint would go down.
Just to build on that, are some clients
Sure, somebody here knows the answer.
Yeah. Are some clients asking for a CO2 reduction instead of a monetary reduction as a metric of choice?
Well, yeah, it's a great question because as you pointed out, we're taking most of the savings because we use those savings to pay for the equipment. That's the sort of fundamental bargain that people are making. They don't want to pay anything. We get the savings. They'll get the 5%, which ends up being 20% if we're saving 25%. So they get 20, we get 80, but they can take credit for all of the carbon footprint reduction as a company, because some of these big franchisee groups might be publicly traded or they might have venture capital that in fact is itself publicly traded. So there's a real desire to take credit for those carbon reductions.
Right. Okay, another question in the room.
Yeah, so the presentation is very interesting. It's very interesting to know that fast food use the most energy. Then my question is, what can Budderfly do for those fast food restaurants to save energy or improve energy efficiency? Because for commercial buildings, for example, here, of course, they have light sensors, but some buildings, they don't have light sensors. You put lighter sensors on, then you can save 30% easily because nobody is here during the night. The similar thing for HVAC, if it's constant on 24/7, then if you have some control systems, then turn them off during the night, then it's still 20%, 30% saving easily. Then for those fast food restaurants, then they're either cooling or heating. Then for cooling, well, then those refrigerators, they're already pretty high energy efficient.
Yeah, so let me try to deal with that. So yes, it turns out that even well-run places sometimes forget to turn air conditioners off at night or heaters. So it turns out that the easiest savings is what we call the vacancy factor. When a building is not being used after 11 p.m. or before 6 a.m. or whatever, you would be amazed in America how much waste there is. So, the fundamental issue of setback thermostats, even for sophisticated businesses, is still often overlooked or is not properly taken into. And so the whole study of how much can I reduce the temperature in the wintertime or increase the temperature in the summertime when the building isn't being used and then get back into the right set point when there are people in there is a huge part of the equation, number one. Number two, there are new ways that you can sort of, operate even things like freezers and whatever. So we're looking at new refrigerants. We're looking at, can you pre-cool them and then turn them off for a little bit during different times? So these are all being studied. Lights are certainly an issue. So I will say that, for us, as you saw, the biggest cost is cooking, and that is not something that we are allowed to touch because it's one thing to sort of talk about what the comfort level is for the clients and how you make it cold or how you make it hot. It's a very another thing to sort of talk about how that Whopper gets made or how the Big Mac gets made or how the Wendy's sandwich gets made or the Kentucky Fried Chicken. Hands off. We have looked at things like bread ovens at Dunkin' Donuts, at Subways. We have looked at induction stovetops in fast food restaurants. And they're not ready to make that transition yet for a variety of reasons, but I do think that there's going to be a sort of eventually with new stores and with new sort of corporate models and net zero restaurants that will be publicized in the Wall Street Journal, I do think that people will be moving to different cook areas. But right now, the low-hanging fruit is make sure you're not wasting electricity when the building is empty. Amazing how much energy is wasted in that. And there are even well-known, prosperous buildings, retailers who are not putting in LED lights yet, just because the fixtures have to be changed or it's messy or whatever. So that's clearly something that we're doing as well. But, you know, the last 5 years with COVID, with changes in this particular industry, and I'll just focus on fast food for a second, the shift from 60% in-store eating to 40% out to the other way around, where now it's 70% takeout and 30% in-store eating. These are just sort of traumatic things that take up the brain cells of major CEOs of the 250 top stores. And so the ability to sort of talk about also changing out thousands of air conditioning systems or heating systems or upgrading their freezers, it really goes to some of those things that we looked at. It's like, I'll get to it in a couple of years, don't bother me. I got bigger things to do. If anybody's been through a drive-through, you know the kind of technology that's going into making sure you order the right thing and then upgrade to the right size drink, because this is what they're concerned about, because it's all about market value and it's about share value. So it turns out that energy efficiency is often going to be the last thing that anybody, even a university administrator, worrying about students and student debt and worrying about football teams and football coaches or whatever, there just are other things that occupy the minds of somebody than multi-million, multi-billion-dollar upgrades of equipment. And so if these things can't happen organically, what we're sort of saying is, and they can't just happen through government incentives, how do we make sure that there's a business model out there so that the things that do work well, you know, in the industrialized West, which is venture capital, private equity, bank debt, that the people who are out there sort of making the society at least work well for money, how do we make sure that energy efficiency is part of that system and is being sort of included as one of the ways that you can get a return on capital? And so we're environmentalists, but we're also proud to be capitalists.
All right, so we have to be careful how much we eat at fast food restaurants, and tomorrow when the president's here, I have to ask him if he has more conversations about energy efficiency than football, and to make sure that we make that happen going forward. So let's thank Matthew Nemerson again, Budderfly, new business model for energy efficiency. Thank you very much.